Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the first round of the 2024 NHL entry draft for the San Jose Sharks. Now, in years past, when I've discussed the draft, I have packaged the first round together with rounds 2 to 7 into one compact video that I would post the day after the first round would conclude. This is because while the first round is usually an impactful and important part for the San Jose Sharks of their draft, and really for every NHL franchise, it's not usually a massive deal that warrants its own standalone video. That is different here this year. This was an incredibly important draft for the San Jose Sharks coming into it. This is the type of draft that in 3 to 5 years' time, Sharks fans can look back on and say this was the turning point of the franchise, and we can see exactly why that is. Not only did the Sharks have the first overall pick, which would already be a huge deal for the organization, but they also had the 11th overall pick on top of that, meaning this was an opportunity to draft not one, but two impact and potentially even superstar players in the early parts of the first round. Now, when it comes to that first overall selection, it was always obvious who the Sharks would end up with. The past few weeks, the past few months, perhaps even the past couple of years, it has been known that Macklin Celebrini would be the first overall selection of the 2024 NHL entry draft. There have been many different mock drafts with many players' names floating around through 2 to 10 to all these different spots, but one thing that has been that constant throughout the entirety of the year has been Macklin Celebrini at number 1, and Mike Grier did not make it a secret in the weeks leading up to the draft that would be his choice. One did not even necessarily have to tune into the draft to know that Celebrini would be a Shark by the end of the night. Now, when it comes to what Celebrini is going to bring to this organization, I touched on it briefly when the Sharks originally won the draft lottery about a month and a half ago, but I'll talk a bit more about that here. Celebrini has had comparisons to players like Jonathan Toews, a former captain of the Chicago Blackhawks, who led them to 3 Stanley Cups as a very solid offensive guy, but also an incredibly strong defensive player, frequently in competition for the Frank J. Selke Trophy, the trophy for the league's best defensive player. One thing that is very big about Celebrini is that he is expected to be one of the most well-rounded first overall prospects that the NHL has seen in a very long time. You take a look at last year with Connor Bedard, he has absolutely elite, in fact otherworldly offensive talent, and we saw that on full display in his first season with the Chicago Blackhawks. But from a defensive standpoint, there was a lot of expected struggles there. The same happened with another generational talent back in 2015, Connor McDavid. But Celebrini is expected to immediately bring a high compete level on both sides of the puck as he makes the jump to the NHL level, which is something that you don't usually see as a number 1 player. But I talked about the comparisons to Jonathan Toews. One thing that might slightly differ is that Toews, while was a solid offensive guy, was never a world beater in that particular area. But when it comes to Celebrini, while he might not be as competitive with the likes of McDavid and Kucherov up at 130 or 140 points, Celebrini is expected to be an incredibly productive offensive player as well. So to get someone who is not only elite on the offensive side of the puck, but also the defensive side of the puck, as well as bringing significantly strong intangibles to the game as well in terms of compete and leadership and competitiveness and all of that, means that this is an absolute home run of a first overall selection for the San Jose Sharks. And it is expected that he, like I said, can make the jump to the NHL as soon as next year. Mike Grier said as much in his interview right after that selection, where he said he thinks Celebrini belongs in the NHL next season. We know Celebrini has been rather coy in interviews talking about whether or not he makes the jump, saying he has to talk to Mike Grier, he has to talk to his coaching staff, he has to talk to his family, but I suspect by the time the start of next year rolls around, Celebrini will be in teal. But like I said, this was the obvious choice. You didn't really have to tune in to know that this would end up being the result of the day. What was more intriguing for the San Jose Sharks was their 11th overall selection. Coming into the day yesterday, the Sharks had 14th and then made the change with the Buffalo Sabres by giving them the 42nd overall pick to move up 3 spots. And this was a relatively criticized trade in the hockey world. Surprising that Mike Grier would not only make a trade-up move the day before the draft, but that he'd give up a relatively early second round to just move up 3 spots. But like I mentioned in my video talking about that deal, there was a very important threshold for him to cross, and I will reiterate that here tonight. in that there was expected to be a top 6 group of defensemen in this year's draft that were a step above any other defenseman available. And we know that the Sharks really desperately needed a strong defensive prospect in their prospect pool. And had they remained at 14th overall, as we know now, they wouldn't have had the option to take any of those 6 players. But by jumping up to 11, they gave themselves a real shot of grabbing having the option to grab at the very least one of those players. Now, it was originally expected that that player would be Carter Yakimchuk. He seemed to be the odd man out in that top 6, and the Sharks would probably only have the option to take him at 11th, so if they wanted a defenseman, that would probably end up being their guy. But the top 10 picks of this draft did not necessarily go as expected. There were a couple of very big surprises, the first one coming at 3rd overall. Of course, the Sharks take Macklin Celebrini, no surprise there, and the Chicago Blackhawks lock down Levshunov as their defenseman of choice. But then at 3rd overall, the Anaheim Ducks end up drafting Beckett Seneke, a very late riser in the draft, who he himself was absolutely shocked and surprised to go at 3rd overall. In fact, a couple of months ago when I made my draft preview video discussing who the Sharks could take at 14th overall, Beckett Seneke was one of those options. So for him to go 3rd overall came as a big surprise, and as a forward, it meant as though the Sharks' chances of getting a good defenseman at 11th had shot up considerably, especially when you also consider the fact that at 4th overall, it was Lindstrom, at 5th overall, it was Demidov, and at 6th overall, it was Tej Aginla. At 7th overall is where the Sharks got their next big surprise, where the Ottawa Senators finally drafted a defenseman there after a big run of forwards, but they ended up going with Carter Yakimchuk, the defenseman who seemed to be the odd man out of this year's top 6. And so everything was just completely thrown into the air at that point. It was entirely unknown who, even though it was for a sure thing that the Sharks would have at least one of those defensemen available for them, it was unsure who that one defenseman would be. And as the Seattle Kraken ended up picking Catton at 8th overall, it was known that the Sharks would not only have one defenseman, but they'd actually be able to have the benefit of making a choice between 2 defensemen for themselves. At 9th overall, Zane Parik would be taken off the board, and 10th overall by the Devils, it would be Anton Silayev, which means the Sharks had the choice between Zeev Buium and Sam Dickinson. And I know there were many Sharks fans who were exceptionally hopeful that the Sharks would somehow manage to grab Zeev Buium, but in many mock drafts, he was expected to be easily in the top 10 and likely closer to even the top 5 or top 7 of the draft. So the fact that he had dropped to that point likely got a lot of Sharks fans excited, and the fact that he didn't end up getting chosen probably got a lot of Sharks fans relatively upset. But the other choice that the Sharks had, not a bad one at all. The Sharks end up drafting another defenseman, Sam Dickinson, from the London Knights, and he was also expected to be in that same range as Zeev Buium. Many people even believed Dickinson, after Levshunov, was the best defenseman in the draft, and strong two-way guy playing in a very well-known and well-renowned organization in the OHL, the London Knights, under Dale Hunter, who is an extremely well-respected person in the hockey world. It also should be noted that Sam Dickinson was playing with another Sharks prospect, Kasper Haltunen, which is perhaps where this certain level of familiarity came for the Sharks the scouting staff, and perhaps a reason for why Dickinson was the choice over Buium in this particular position at 11th overall. On top of that, Dickinson does bring a very hefty element of size to his game. At 6'3", that is quite tall for a defenseman even at the NHL level, while Buium's still not short or anything, but just a solid 6 foot, so that could be another reason for the choice. And when it comes to Dickinson, what he is expected to bring to the table, like I said, a two-way guy. Usually when you're drafting a defenseman in the early parts, sometimes you can end up with someone who just brings a very heavy offensive element. This is the case with players like Carter Yakimchuk or Zane Parik, guys who have a heavy index in the offensive side of things, but defensively can leave a lot to be desired. Dickinson is not that type of player. While he can put up some hefty amount of points, he was the 4th leading scorer amongst defensemen in the OHL this past season, and amongst draft-eligible players, he was second only behind Zane Parik, taken at 9th overall by the Calgary Flames. but he also has that defensive game, which can make him an extremely reliable and high floor player for the San Jose Sharks. It is expected that he should be able to, from all accounts, be able to be at the very least minimum, a second pairing defenseman at the NHL with a very high chance of being a top pairing guy for the San Jose Sharks within even just a couple of years. Now, in playing in London, you are with a lot of very good players there with the Knights, so it is possible that there is some inflation to the offensive stats that he ended up putting up, but it should also be noted that unlike a player like Zane Parik, who was the number one power play guy, the power play quarterback on his respective OHL team, Dickinson was not given that opportunity with the London Knights. They had one of the best power plays in the OHL, but he was not featured on that first power play unit. So as we move into next season, as I imagine Dickinson will head back to the OHL at least for one more year, perhaps even just for the one more year, he'll have an opportunity to really be the perhaps number one defensive guy, number one defenseman just in general on London, and will get the chance to see what he can do in that particular role. But like I said, I'm sure many Sharks fans were definitely hoping for Zeev Buium. The fact that he was available at 11 seemed to be just an absolute miracle for San Jose, but Sam Dickinson is not a bad choice, ends up being a really solid player, and had you told me just a week ago that the Sharks would somehow end up drafting both Celebrini and Sam Dickinson in the first round, I would have called you crazy, and yet it is Mike Grier's world, and we are all just living in it at this point. So it was an absolutely perfect first round for the San Jose Sharks. That trade up from 14th overall to 11th overall ended up being an absolute outstanding trade for the San Jose Sharks, and I'm quite excited to see how Mike Grier ends up finishing the draft tomorrow for rounds 2 to 7, and I'm extremely excited to see how this next season ends up going. Class dismissed.